Cast it into the fire! Destroy it! No.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about one of my favorite things in the whole wide world. Sorry about the sound of my voice and stuff. I'm dealing with the aftermath of one of the worst summer colds I've ever had, which makes a whole lot of freaking sense because it's hot enough outside right now to fry an egg on my bald head. Anyway, before we get into that, we are a teeny tiny little channel, so it would really help us out if you could like this video and subscribe if you like what you see. We've got a lot more stuff coming, whether you like it or not though. So there's that. Scary stories to tell in the dark. These books are awesome. A lot of you know what I'm talking about. I did not know that Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was as popular as it is, until years later. In fact, I went through most of my life not realizing how popular they were. I just thought it was like this niche thing that like I knew about and nobody else knew. It was some kind of, you know, forbidden secret in my mind. But I remember when a good friend of mine, we were talking about something, he was like, oh yeah, that's from those books, the Scary Stories books. He's like, I grew up with those. And I think that was what strengthened the bond. So, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the books, they were written by Alvin Schwartz, and the artwork was done by a guy named Stephen Gammell. And the artwork is amazing, don't get me wrong, but it feels like every time people talk about these books, all they ever talk about is the artwork, and the artwork's awesome. Super scary, the stuff of nightmares. But I feel like the artwork kind of overshadows the rest of the book, and it kind of bothers me a little bit because the stories are really freaking good. In fact, I've even heard some reviews where people kind of talk down on the stories. They're just like, yeah, the stories are okay, but the artwork, and I'm just like, no, the stories are freaking awesome. Alvin Schwartz, he took over a year to write each book. I believe I read somewhere, maybe. I could also be lying. So I'm going to get into my personal history with these books, but I actually did not start with the books. I started with the audiobooks. The audiobooks on cassette. How old is that? The audiobooks were narrated by a guy named George Irving, and if I'm remembering correctly, it's the same guy who does the voice of the Heat Miser in that weird Christmas special with Rudolph, I think.
I'm Mr. Green Christmas. I'm Mr.
I didn't even know there were books. I just was listening to these audiobooks on cassette when we were on a road trip in St. Louis, and my dad somehow acquired these things, and he put them on, and I distinctly remember my mom being like, David! And David is the name of my father as well. She wasn't yelling at me, not yet. But anyway, she was like, David, what did you put on for the kids? And in the meantime, as a 9-year-old, I'm sitting in the backseat just like, I don't know what this is, but it might be the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. Then I got a hold of them books, and my life, especially as an artist, I've always been into drawing and painting and stuff like that. My life as an artist was changed forever. You know, listening to the audiobooks, you form an image in your head of how these stories look. And it was like, and everybody always says whatever you can imagine is better and scarier than whatever somebody can show you. And normally that's true. However, when it came to the artwork of these books, it's like it took whatever I was imagining while listening to the stories, and the drawings caught the feeling of whatever I was imagining, whatever scenario or surreal landscape I was imagining in my head. The drawings like caught that feeling and just like magnified it and held on to it. I just love the artwork in these 3 books. And they're just so weird. And like, there's so much like uncanny valley stuff. Why is this book wrapped in plastic? There's so much like uncanny valley stuff. And that's always the creepiest stuff. I don't know if you guys can see that. That's the picture to the story, The Big Toe. But what's up with that kid's ear? And why is his head weird? And why do his fingernails look like claws? Why is his hand dripping what looks like blood? It's just like, it's just weird. Like, I don't know what Stephen Gammell was drinking at the time, but I gotta get me some of that. What's interesting about Stephen Gammell, at least what I've heard, is that he doesn't really do interviews, which is really fascinating. Kind of reminds me of Bill Watterson from Calvin and Hobbes, who literally drew my childhood. But Stephen Gammell, part of you has to respect like these guys kind of turning into Bigfoot after they've done like their magnum opus. But part of me also wonders, just like, is Stephen Gammell just like I know that Bill Watterson looks very highly upon Calvin and Hobbes, thinking of that as like his masterpiece, right? Or I think that's how he looks at it. It makes me wonder if Stephen Gammell just like did these scary children's books, and he's got other artwork, and people just keep bringing up these books, and maybe he just doesn't want to give interviews because he's irritated about it. I don't know, but I would give interviews. If anybody wants to interview me. So I thought I would go over some summaries of these 3 books. The first one, in my mind, like, each book kind of has a theme. I mean, they're all very similar, the stories are, but they each kind of like focus a little differently on like a different area of like scary stories. So the first book is like a surreal, like super weird urban folklore. I grew up in the country, in the woods, basically, in the Midwest, and so like these stories, actually, it's kind of captured on the cover a little bit. I don't know if you can see that. Maybe I can put up a picture. But there's like a barn and a grassy field and a couple of tombstones, a full moon. It's just like out in the countryside. And so when I'm like reading this first book, man, it just like it takes me right back there. Makes you think of like, so for instance, where our house was, we were right next to a cornfield. And we were not allowed to go into the cornfield because my mom was afraid we were going to get lost and die. But it reminds me of like the stuff that you used to imagine as a child, or that I used to imagine as a child, like what was in the cornfield or what was lurking around in the woods, you know, just out here in the middle of nowhere, so far away from cities and stuff. The second book I have right here, it's called More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Ooh, actually there's an also by Alvin Schwartz section here. Let's see what else this guy wrote. I actually have no idea. A twister of twists, a tangler of tongues, tomfoolery, which is trickery and foolery with words. Flapdoodle. Anyway, the second book, in my opinion, it seems to focus more on like ghosts and phantoms and what have you. There's 2, like, if I'm remembering correctly, there is 2 stories in here that take place at sea. There's one about like a haunted ship that appears, and there's one called Somebody Has Fallen from a Loft, which is just, I love that story. It is so freaking atmospheric and spooky. And George Irving, guys, these are all on YouTube, by the way, too. So if you don't look them up, you are doing yourself a disservice. Show them to your kids. Ruin their brains forever. But like George Irving, in that story, he does all these different accents and stuff. He does like different voices for all the stories. He really freaking puts in the work. But man, some of the pictures in here are just like unbelievable. I remember being a kid and thinking that More Scary Stories was my least favorite one. But that was because I actually thought that a story that I think is actually in the third one was in that one, and it's the story The Trouble. If I can give you my only con about these books, it is the story The Trouble. In my opinion, it just goes on too long. It's not super interesting. It's not very scary. I'm not going to hold it against them, though. When you have books as magnificent as these, you are due for at least one little teeny tiny dud. Scary Stories 3. This one is awesome. I mean, they're all awesome. Like I said, this one has the one story I don't like in it, but upon rereading it again, it's like they knew this was going to be the last book, so they put their axes to the grindstone and just threw everything at the wall. And it shows in the stories, it shows in the artwork, they just let it all loose. It seems like it zeroes in on almost like a dreamlike atmosphere, like dark fairy tales almost, is how I would describe the third book. Very abstract, this one seems to be, and you can definitely tell from the freaking balls to the wall illustrations in this book. This one, in my opinion, this one has the scariest illustrations. The haunted house one in the first book, that has like the most famous illustration that everybody says is the scariest, but I think if you really flip through Scary Stories 3, you are going to see some crap. Honestly, the greatest crime against humanity, in my opinion, is the fact that they never recorded the rest of the stories from the first book with George Irving. Ugh, I wish so bad they would have recorded the rest of the stories. Would have been amazing. Maybe I can convince Tyler to do it, but, you know, Tyler, George Irving. Sorry, Tyler. Honestly, these books inspired me so much when I first started writing to, years ago, write my own Scary Stories book called Scary Tales for Around the Fire. Shameless plug. You can get it on Etsy. So wrapping this whole thing up, in my opinion, the legacy of these 3 books is unmatched in children's literature. And quite frankly, they are just as enjoyable to read as an adult as they were when I was a kid. They're my favorite books of all time. I wish there were more, but there is something to be said about just like a solid trilogy. You know what I mean? It's like completion. So I love that they made at least 3 because, you know, it just feels right. David, are you going to mention the movie? Yes. Yes, I am. Yeah, it should be noted that they did attempt to make a film that came out just a few years ago. We're gonna go over that train wreck next time. I guess I kind of already spoiled what my review of that film is going to be like, but it's not gonna be a complete Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark review if I don't at least mention the motion picture. Anyway, if you liked this video, like I said, subscribe, like it, share it, and look forward to the next video that we have coming out. I'd like to start reviewing some of the Goosebumps books that I grew up with as well, so that will be fun. Can't wait to do that. Maybe I'll have my wife sit in on that because she likes those books too. So, bye.